When looking into the stories behind many ghosts and hauntings, a few common themes are usually found. Within the history of almost every supposedly haunted location is a tragedy and a death. But what happens when multiple tragedies and deaths are contained within the history of a single location? In the case of Otsukayama Park, you get a location often cited as one of the most haunted places in Japan, and you get a story that has become a Japanese urban legend. Otsukayama Park is located in the western portion of the greater Tokyo metropolis in a city called Hachioji. The story of Otsukayama Park's haunting begins in 1873 when a small temple was transplanted from Asakusa to its new home in Hachioji. The temple was called Doryodo, and it served as a resting place for people traveling along what was known as the Silk Road connecting Hachioji to Yokohama. The Silk Road was a major trade route, and Doryodo Temple thrived as a result of the constant traffic. In 1909, a young woman by the name of Toshi Asai entered Doryodo Temple to become its new caretaker. During her time at Doryodo Temple, Toshi managed to save a decent amount of money by telling fortunes for local villagers. Then, one night in 1963, Toshi, now 83 years old, was approached by a man who had come looking to rob Toshi and the temple. Toshi was attacked, and her only living daughter would later find her lifeless body in the temple's main building. Today, the walls of Doryodo Temple no longer stand, but the floor where Toshi Asai was murdered still remains. It was on this spot in Otsukayama Park where Toshi was found, stabbed through the heart and with her throat slashed. Toshi's grave was placed in a small cemetery near the temple, a cemetery which also contains graves for the daughter who found her and her 2 children who had died in infancy. Even though Toshi's body might be at rest, it is said that her spirit still continues to roam the grounds where she spent the majority of her life. Almost immediately after news of Toshi's murder became known, rumors began to spread of people hearing the cries of a woman sobbing near the temple. To this day, people still report feeling an unknown presence watching them and hearing a woman crying when visiting the grounds where Doryodo Temple once stood. The reason for her cries, though, remains unclear. Is Toshi lamenting her own death, or does she regret the loss of the money that she was perhaps saving for the temple or her daughter? Or maybe Toshi isn't the only one crying in Otsukayama Park. In 1973, Kyoko Seki, a 24-year-old college student at Rikkyo University, began to have an affair with her 38-year-old professor, Hiroshi Oba. The relationship began to get complicated when Kyoko discovered that she was pregnant. In fear for his job, his reputation, and his marriage, Hiroshi decided to take drastic action in order to cover up his affair. On July 20th, 1973, Hiroshi met Kyoko and took her to his home in Hachioji. It is unclear exactly what happened between the two, but Kyoko was never heard from again. Apparently, Hiroshi could not deal with whatever terrible deed he had done that day, and less than 2 months later the bodies of Hiroshi, his wife, and his 2 children were discovered in nearby Shizuoka, the result of an apparent suicide. Kyoko, however, was still missing. In February of 1974, 223 days after her disappearance, Kyoko's body was discovered in a shallow grave near Doryodo Temple. Her corpse was partially mummified by this point, but evidence pointed to her having been strangled and then hastily dumped where she was eventually found. Soon after her body had been recovered, reports began to emerge that her body was discovered after people heard a young woman calling out from the woods. Apparently, the spirit of Kyoko Seki wanted to be found so that she could finally be put to rest. But was that truly the end of Kyoko's story? Some people believe that after Kyoko's body was discovered, her spirit moved on, but others believe that she still roams the area where her body lay for nearly 7 months. Of course, as with any urban legend, the specific details of the story behind the hauntings at Otsukayama Park differ slightly depending on the source, but there is a clear and verifiable history of death and tragedy associated with the land where Otsukayama Park now stands. The temple itself was abandoned in 1983 and it was torn down in 1990. But remnants of the building still exist as reminders of what was once a bustling stop on a thriving trade route. The stone markers in Otsukayama Park are physical reminders of the area's past. But if you go to Otsukayama Park and stay very quiet, you might actually hear the cries of the past reminding you that what was once full of life is now associated only with death.